Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Triad Coaching Connection. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm getting ready to say this. August meeting. We are well into this year, the year that keeps on giving, right? But we are expecting 77 participants to today's program. And I have shared my screen so you can see our mission statement. I'm hoping that everybody can see the document that I have there. I would like to start for a few minutes by asking you to make sure you're muted. And I don't want you to unmute. I'd like this to be a moment of silent reflection. And I want to ask you, when you first read the title of today's program, what thoughts went through your mind? What was your first reaction as you saw the title to today's program? I don't want your second or your third reaction, but what popped in your mind? Reflect on that for just a moment. And now what I'd like for you to do is to reflect for a moment as to why did you go there? Why was that your reaction? Whatever it may have been. What brought that about?
Wanda, this is Lynn. I'm so sorry.
That's fine. We're just getting started, so you're doing fine. And also, what I would like for everyone to do is to just reflect on how open your mind is to participating today and to listening to our speaker, Lynn Fick Cooper, who is going to help put some clarity to the biases that all of us have. We all have them. But one of the things that makes us powerful coaches is understanding those and understanding where they come from. So I believe you're going to find today's program to be extremely rich. I am honored to be the president of an organization who has this mission statement, and I'm going to share this with you as we do at every meeting. Our mission is to develop and sustain a learning community that supports coaches and those interested in the practice of coaching. Triad Coaching Connection supports and preserves the integrity of a diverse and inclusive coaching profession through networking, learning opportunities, and educating others. This is what our programs are all about. So I am going to stop share now, and I am going to mute myself after I turn this over to Dr. Harrell Roberts, who is going to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Roberts?
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. I say good morning to Triad Coaching Connection members and guests. It is my privilege to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker, our facilitator today, Lynn Fick Cooper, someone I've known for many, many years. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about and introduce you to the persons who are part of the Triad Coaching Connection Diversity Committee. And those members include our president, Wanda Swain, who is our navigator today and also is the president of the Triad Coaching Connection. Also, I'd like to introduce, you'll make you aware of Tom Stratton, who is the Diversity Committee Chair. The other members involved in this endeavor today are Sherry Abernathy, Shirley Carr, Jo Heather Dodson, Linda Reese, Marilyn Taylor, Marianne Upson, and last but not least, Joyce Richmond. Joyce and I were the two persons who approached the Diversity Committee about the idea, the topic of white privilege. And we got some resistance and some little kickback, but it was accepted. And Joyce also knows Lynn Fick Cooper quite well also, and she also endorsed Lynn Fick Cooper's presentation here this morning. But let me give you a little backdrop about how we as a committee got here. And I think there's a confluence of factors going on. One is the reality of COVID-19 pandemic. This virulent disease has caused enormous amount of death. I think the current figure is 163,000 Americans have been killed by this virus. It appears that while the slogan is that we're all in this together, it appears that it's been disproportional in terms of which persons or which factors or which groups have been disproportionately harmed by this virulent strain. In fact, as I understand it from the data, that persons who are senior in years, living in nursing homes and the like, have tended to been particularly harmed to the degree of enormous amount of deaths taking place within that community or those communities. The other reality about this virulent strain is that it has impacted people of color particularly disproportionately. The data indicates African Americans, Latinos, or Latinx is a term I think we're using these days, along with Native Americans in particular have been harmed disproportionately by this illness. Furthermore, in terms of the restrictions on this illness, a lot of people have not been able to go to work. They cannot go to work. And then there are others who have been told that they are essential personnel, people who must go to work. So as we talk about privilege today, some folks have been privileged to be able to stay home and to work from their homes, to have an income and the like, where others have been less fortunate, not having jobs or having jobs whereby they are put in harm's way by the nature of their work. And again, we call these essential personnel. And oftentimes those persons are persons who are poorly paid in our economy. I saw a report earlier this morning about the number of people who may be dispossessed from their homes because of the virus not being able to work and the like. So this illness has been disproportionate in terms of the consequences for various persons in our communities. So I think that is one issue. The other thing I should say too is, in terms of the pandemic, that people being home and having security being home, but at the same time, they've had to deal with their children. And that's been a challenge. So maybe we have new respect for teachers, maybe, by the way, too, out of this whole thing. The other confluence is about people being home, was people being able to be on their screens and seeing May 25th, when George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis, Minnesota police officer. People saw this event. A 17-year-old girl, I understand, was mindful enough to record that event, and that death went viral across the world. As a result of that, there's been this kind of international set of demonstrations about racism and about disparity and about injustice. It's been enormous what has happened here. So these confluences have been factors in the diversity committee coming to the fore saying, we should present something to our membership and to our guests in terms of this set of events, these realities happening here. So this is where we are today in terms of that. So talking about privilege, I want to talk a little bit about myself for a moment. I'm gonna get personal here for a minute to tell you a little bit about me. I was a sophomore at Drake University, and I was dating this woman. In fact, I was smitten by this woman, to be honest with you. And in fact, I thought things were going really very well between she and myself. And one day out of the blue, she said to me, "Harrell, you are privileged." I was taken aback. Me being privileged? What do you mean me being privileged? Not me. In my mind, the people who I thought about as being privileged included, I had a 10th grade world history teacher, Mrs. Benjamin, who was driven to school every day from Manhattan, from Park Avenue to Brooklyn, New York, at my boys' high school where I attended. It was called Boys High School. And she was driven and picked up every day by her chauffeur in her black Cadillac. I saw Miss Benjamin as being privileged. As an undergraduate at Drake University, a school of some renown in Des Moines, Iowa, and a couple of my fellow students were a sister and brother who were heirs to the Walgreen fortune. I thought of those folks as being privileged, but not me. In actuality, that woman who became my wife, who still holds me to task, was right. I have been privileged. I've been privileged enough to be here today to talk to you. As Wanda said, introduce me as being Dr. Roberts. Yes, I have a doctorate too, and other things. But the deal is that everyone has not been equally privileged in society. Be it structural racism, what you want to call it, whatever you want to be, the issue of race, which I think is a misnomer, is fact. So the issue is that I had to look at myself in terms of my privilege as having gone to a particular university, having had a very fine public school education, which is not very common these days, unfortunately. And the other privilege I had was 1994 when I was invited to be at the Center for Creative Leadership. And this place out there in 220, little bastion there, and people see it's being a castle. And there I had another experience with me confronting myself about my privilege. Lynn, Fick, our speaker today, was also part of that program that was being sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that looked at equity, diversity, and inclusion. And once more, I found myself being called short in looking at my own privilege. And that I was there in that program, realizing that the magnitude of my privilege, and I'm African-American male, having privilege. Lynn was there, and she and I talked during that day. We sat at the same table. I've always respected her as a colleague. But that day was another factor in my life in meeting her in a different plane. So often in terms of ethnic relationships, there's always a lot of kinds of barriers that tend to happen based upon our societal structures. The thing about Lynn, I've always admired, there's a sense of her being very present with me and with others. Joyce and I both talked about Lynn as being a facilitator for us today. That was endorsed by others as well. And when I called Lynn to ask her to do the program, she said to me, Harrell, when do you want me there? Now, this is one busy woman, and her plate is awfully full, as I've learned to say, living here in the South. But she said, when do you want me, and what can we do? We talked about privilege. She said, Harrell, I'll be glad to do it. So what I'd like to do, let you know someone I respect, I admire, someone I hold in the highest sense of self-esteem, is Lynn Fick Cooper. Lynn, I'm gonna hand it to you. It's yours. Take it on with it. You're so
Thank you, Harrell.
You're most welcome. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you. I was about to cut you off so you didn't set the bar too high with the expectations this morning. You can tell I've bribed Joyce and Harrell and some others well over the years to get such a kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with all of you. When Harrell called, first of all, I have a soft spot for Harrell. I will admit that. And so when Harrell asks me to do something, it's very hard for me to say no. He's managed to get a lot out of me over the years related to that soft spot. And so even with my schedule the way it is, given this particular group, because I know many of you from your associations as coaches with CCL over the years and appreciate those relationships a great deal. So I was willing to help in any way that my schedule would allow. And as it turned out, we could find a date and a couple of hours to make this happen. I will tell you that this has been a journey for me for the better part of more than a decade now. I don't profess to be an expert on the topic of white privilege or racism or equity, diversity, and inclusion, but I have about 13 years now of lived experience and what I would call scar tissue from having to deal with it in the classroom with our CCL participants and falling on my face more than once or twice in trying to handle it appropriately. We are working diligently at CCL to expand and broaden the way we address these issues in the midst of our leadership development work, not just through coaching, our coaching practice, which many of you have participated in some other experiences we've provided coaches related to that, but also in what we do in the classroom. And it's a journey. It's an evolving body of work. But with what experience I have, I told Harrell, I said, look, I'm not going to do a session, a deep dive on the subject of racism, per se, but I can facilitate the group through an exploration of what it means, what privilege means. We'll use racism as a primary construct to explore it at a couple different levels today. And so hopefully you will feel like you've gotten good value out of this 2 hours, and you're going to do a lot of the work. As is typical with a CCL process, I'm going to put you in breakout groups a couple different times so that you'll have a chance to talk to each other about these concepts more than listen to me talk about it. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up some slides. So bear with me for a second when we get that done. Okay, now when I share my screen on Zoom, I cannot see all of you as well on video. So somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, because I can see your video. Just a visual thumbs up is cool if you can see my slides. Just put your thumb in front of your face. Thumbs up in front of your face if you can see. Yep. Okay. Thank you, Robin. I saw your thumbs up. Appreciate that. Okay, good. Just want to make sure you can see it. So we're going to get started first with just some learning agreements that I want to make sure we have in the room, or in the virtual room, the plenary room we're in now, as well as in the breakout rooms when you meet with each other about these topics. I don't know how many of you know each other really well. And so to cover a topic like privilege and make it personal in the course of 2 hours, especially with people you might not be that familiar with, is a little risky, because typically we would delve into this topic a little further into a leadership experience with a group of people, and they would have built some psychological safety with each other. I did ask Wanda and Harrell and Tom in our prep meeting how much you all know each other and whether there was already a degree of psychological safety between you, and they felt there was enough that we could go deep, or as deep as we can in 2 hours. But with that in mind, a couple of quick learning agreements to sort of set the tone for our time together. One, I really want you to think about speaking from your own point of view throughout the time we're together today and when you're in breakout rooms with each other. So speak your truth, meaning speak from I statements, not you statements, not generalizable statements, not, well, I've seen others experience this. What has your lived experience been? I statements, speak from your own truth. It will make it more real for you and for others, and keep it at the personal level. And honestly, with this kind of work, the work has to begin with each of us first. Respectful listening. So instead of listening to respond, which we often do, as you all know, in your own, I'm sure, work and coaching practice, we need to be truly trying to stay present and listen to the experiences of our colleagues as we interact with each other today, rather than thinking about what our response is or what our own story is. So deep, respectful listening, trying to be as present as possible. Take space, make space is another way of saying, you know, if you're really extroverted and you tend to dominate conversation, to hold back a little bit so that you make room for others, and thus making space. And the same would be true for those who tend to hold back or be quieter, to take the space as asked of you today, when it's time for each of you to do some sharing, both whether that's in dyads or in small groups, because you'll do a little bit of both. Having a growth mindset today. So I heard Wanda tee it up at the beginning with having an open mind, coming to the session with an open mind. That's a part of being in a growth mindset. Fixed mindsets are those that we see as unchangeable, right? A growth mindset, according to Carol Dweck's work, is one where you are open to learning. And so we've got varying degrees of literal degrees on this call, as well as experiences, but we can all continue to learn. And so if you approach this session with a sense that you have something to learn, regardless of what that is, and that you will get that today, it'll help in the conversation. Share your hope and your strength. This is tough work, right? And as Harrell teed up some of the events that have happened in society most recently, but have been happening in society for hundreds of years, that we are facing and grappling with still and trying to reconcile as a nation, if not a globe, it can be daunting, and it takes resilience. And so we'd ask each of you to share, as appropriate, opportunities for hope and how you get strength as you deal with some of the things that we'll be discussing. Educate yourself. This is pretty critical in this work. A lot of our people of color, colleagues, friends, get tired, frankly, of sort of educating us white folks on what it means to experience racism. So take the time, if you haven't already. There's a lot of great books, there's a lot of literature, articles, things to read to educate yourself about that experience, as opposed to expecting our colleagues of color to be the ones who have to educate us about what this is like. It's exhausting for people of color, honestly, to sort of always be the ones. Like, trying to help white people figure it out. A good book to read if you haven't is White Fragility. Another one I would recommend is Stamped from the Beginning. There are many, and there are some shorter articles and lots of things one could do, but take the time to educate yourself and not expect your colleagues, while you can learn from their experiences through the conversations I'll tee up today, do the work on your own to get really educated. Ouch and oops is just that. If you say something today that is offensive to somebody else, you know, people have, please have permission on the call as you're talking with people to say, ouch, that hurts, and here's why, right? Give that feedback about that, because that's how we learn. And a lot of our language and jargon and colloquialisms are laden with language that can be hurtful, and we may not even realize it. So if that happens as you're having a conversation about your experience, say out. If it hurts, say ouch and say why. And then if you're a person who actually said something that was offensive, say, oops, wow, thanks for telling me. I didn't know that, or I'll pay more attention to that in the future. So again, part of that growth mindset, being open to learning as we go through this. Is there any, I'm going to give just a brief moment, any other learning agreements that you all want to make sure are present today for us to engage in this conversation about privilege most effectively? Either chat those, or you can unmute and tell me.
Lynn, one thing I would like to ask is that if you have a book recommendation, if you have a moment to add that to the chat, so everybody will have a record of the books that, or any other resources, that helps us once we leave this space to have those resources to look back to.
That's a great suggestion, Wanda, because there's a lot of good stuff out there. So I'm sure many of you have read.
And are you able to read the chats that are coming in?
I am. I see a mindful pause between speakers. Yep. Stories remain confidential unless you receive permission. Confidentiality often comes up. I appreciate that. So Zippy also said what's said here stays here. And so absolutely be mindful of people are going to share perhaps very personal stories. And while you may learn lessons from that you want to share, the story is not yours. And so if you don't get permission to share the story, anonymize it as much, obviously, or not share at all to share the lesson. But the stories are the people in the room, and they need to give permission for that to be shared. Mindful pause between speakers. I appreciate that. Be brave. Name the elephants in the room when you see them. Right. I think courageous conversations, we hear a lot about the notion of courageous conversations. It takes real courage to raise things like that when there's an elephant in the room. I would encourage that as well. Good, people are putting books in. Excellent. Okay, well, we're going to move on. If something comes up through the course of the day that you want to, either we're not living up to these learning agreements or you want to add one, please don't hesitate to chat it or pause me as we go. Back to my slides here. Okay. The agenda. So we're going to start with, in just a moment, I'll tee up the questions with just a quick breakout in pairs where I'm going to have you just have a quick exchange about a couple of dialogue prompts around this subject, just to get you started, and a little bit of a primer. We're going to level set a bit on some terms. I'll define a couple of terms. And then you were sent a questionnaire on privilege that hopefully you had a chance to complete. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll have you back in breakout rooms discussing what that experience was like as you completed the questionnaire on privilege. If you haven't completed it, I know Wanda sent it out. I would encourage you to do that during that part where we talk about it, and or a little bit leading up to that. I'll try to give a pause for a moment for people to do that if you haven't had time to do it ahead of this session. We'll engage in small group breakouts. Then I'm going to layer on some more around we're going to use racism as the primary construct of privilege that we talk about. And I will layer on a couple of other ways to think about racism, and then we'll have you back in breakout rooms at the end. So that's our roadmap for where we're going in the next hour and a half or so. And here's, before Wanda puts you in breakout rooms, there are two prompts that I want you to discuss with your partner. This is the first one. When I hear the phrase white privilege, my first thought is, and just answer that, right? And each of you will answer this particular prompt. When I hear the phrase white privilege, my first thought is, Now you won't be able to see this slide when you get in the breakout room. So if you have a smartphone, you might want to take a picture of the screen or jot this down. I'll chat these, or maybe Wanda, if you could chat this phrase so that it stays in the chat and people can look at that while in breakouts. And then the second prompt is a specific moment when I learned a lesson about identity or social justice was. Now, when we talk about identity, we're talking about, we all have various identities, different things about that make us who we are and put us in certain social groups, like being white, being female, being educated with certain degrees, being in certain professions. There are multiple, being heterosexual, homosexual, being of a certain age, being in a particular class, socioeconomic class. You could name lots of different identities that make up who we are, being a particular political persuasion, you name it. There are many social groups to which we belong, parts of our identities. And so I would encourage you, the first time you learned a lesson about one of your identities, something that happened to you related to being, to part of who you are, that, and or something related to social justice, they could be connected. So just what was a specific moment when this became conscious for you? That, oh, wow, I'm treated a certain way because of this part of who I am and or related to social justice. So this is just talking about these two prompts, this particular exercise. So you are looking for, let me go back to this previous slide. When I hear the phrase white privilege, my first thought is, and a specific moment when I really learned a lesson about one of my identities and or social justice was. And you're gonna have just about 8 minutes or so in the breakout room, so 4 minutes each to give your sort of general responses to these two prompts. So it's not time for really deep conversation, just to kind of get you started with a partner. Any questions about what I'm asking you to do in this first breakout? Wanda, are you good to send people into pairs?
I am trying to figure out why I'm getting quite a few chats that they didn't receive the questionnaire. So I am going to send that in the chat, a link that they can open it. So my apologies, everyone. There is a link coming, but yes, I have the chat ready to go, and I will open it when you're ready. I mean, the breakout room is ready to go.
If there are no questions, please don't fret if you didn't complete the privilege questionnaire. Let's focus on this conversation right now. I will give you a few minutes when it comes time for that, for people to fill it out who may not have had a chance to do that. So please don't worry about that. I can see a lot of concerned faces of people on the video who didn't get it and are wishing and feeling like they didn't do their homework. That's never a good feeling to show up to class without your homework. So don't fret. Let's focus just on having this conversation right now with these two prompts. When I hear the phrase white privilege, my first thought is, and then this prompt on the screen, you'll give it about 8 minutes with a partner to have a conversation about these two prompts, and then we'll bring you back. So go ahead and put them in breakout rooms, Wanda. And welcome back, everybody. So I think Wanda's gonna try to mute folks just so we can cut down on background noise. Yeah, so I hope, we don't have time to do a debrief on that conversation, but I hope it started you down this path with a partner from the session, just talking about what those experiences were like for you. Oh, okay.
Yep,
Unmuted myself. Okay. I know I ended up in a breakout room with Harrell, oddly enough, so we had a good little conversation ourselves about our first experiences. So we're going to keep moving, but I hope you will be in breakouts again, not necessarily with the same people, but I hope it started you thinking about these experiences for yourself, because as I mentioned, doing the work on yourself is really where this has to begin. And many of you may have done that. I know you're probably coming at this, all of you on the call today, from different places and in terms of having examined these concepts for yourself. So we're going to get into this idea of privilege and explore that a little more deeply. And so if you received the link from Wanda to the questionnaire and you had not gotten it ahead of time or had a chance to complete it, I would encourage you to do that. I think, Wanda, did you send it in PDF or in Word or in both? in Word. You're muted, but I think I saw you mouth Word.
Word.
Okay, in Word, you can click on the box and it'll check the box for you if you open it in Word, so you don't have to print it out and check it off by hand. You can just click in the box. It's a Word form. And so then just tally the number of X's and type in that tally in the total box, the number of X's in the yes column as you complete it. So I would encourage you, while I talk about this, to begin filling it out. If you haven't already, and those of you who filled it out can just focus on this, this beginning conversation. Just to define what we mean by privilege, what are we talking about? And privilege is the most simple way to state it, because there's lots of nuances to our privilege, but the most simple way to state it is when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of a group they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. So when you think about white privilege, right, just the fact of having white skin gives us advantages and gives us access to things, many things in society that people who are not white-skinned, people of color, do not have the same access to, or is openly and intentionally denied to people of color oftentimes just because of the color of their skin, not because of anything they did or failed to do. And so when you think about some of the ways this shows up for us in society, while one might like to believe that the civil rights movement corrected all of this, and I've had conversations with other white people who would say to me, "Oh, but we passed civil rights laws. Aren't we past all this? Why do we need to give favorable access to African American kids to scholarships to college? Haven't we righted all of this? Haven't we leveled the playing field?" And no, we haven't, right? Because there were a lot of laws put in place, policies and laws and practices, both absolute laws and policies stated and put into practice, and or just cultural norms, but all of it affects the access people have. And so you can think about, we could sit here and go through the history, we're not going to, but you can think about like the GI Bill after the war. White soldiers were given access to low interest loans for land purchase that Black soldiers were not. They both fought in the war. They were denied access to something based on the color of their skin, and that's historical from slavery times and biases and prejudices against people of color. So there are many things like that are based on bias, based on history, policies, laws, where people are denied access. Think about how we privilege men over women. Men in organizations or corporate situations are still often very privileged over women in terms of both employment and advancement. There's a real reason there's a glass ceiling, right, Jennifer Martineau? There's a reason that women do not have the same access to promotions at the most senior levels, because for many years, women weren't even in the workforce. And when they evolved into the workforce and advanced into higher levels, there's still this bias that those are jobs for men, largely white men. So there's a lot of aspects to privilege, but bottom line, it is when one group has something that another doesn't, not based on ability or what they did or didn't do, just based on some aspect of their identity that they have no control over typically, is what we mean by privilege. Any question or comment about that? I'm gonna try to monitor chat as I talk here. It really can be based on lots of different identities. I'm using a lot today. I'll use the construct of race because it's ever present right now. So, and often speak in terms of Black and white people, although that's not the only aspect of racism, right? We experience this, people who are Latinx, people who are indigenous, all kinds of people of color, even mixed race people who may appear white or not, you name it. There's a lot of aspects and nuances to this. And so if I speak in dichotomous terms or it sounds that way to you, it's largely just to make the point, not because I'm overlooking the nuance to it. Okay, hearing no questions. The flip side of privilege is oppression, right? They're really two sides of the same coin, and we'll talk about that. Oppression is, as I mentioned, there are intentional laws, policies, practices in place to exercise power or authority over a group of people that are often burdensome at best, cruel, often unjust. And people who are oppressed have this feeling of being heavily burdened, both mentally and physically, by those things. So when we think about race, right, the privilege of race, I have the privilege of being white, which means I can move through my universe every day without really ever thinking about the color of my skin. and not worrying about it affecting my daily interactions. Whereas people who are people of color, Black, Latinx, you name it, Black or brown individuals, move through the universe typically having to think about the color of their skin and how it will affect them in any given situation many times throughout every day. That in and of itself is the difference between privilege and oppression. I don't even have to think about it, have to think about it all the time, and how I need to behave, therefore, in a certain situation if I'm a person of color, in order to have it not affect me in an overtly negative way in this situation, like with the police, as the example Harrell shared at the beginning with George Floyd and thousands of others who've experienced that. So privilege and oppression really are there two sides of the same coin. If you are privileged in one identity, meaning you are white as opposed to being a person of color, if you're white, you're on the privileged side of that coin. If you're not, you're typically experiencing oppression to some degree. And this exercise, this questionnaire will give you more examples of that across 7 primary types of privilege. As well as then if you don't have it, what it might feel like for yourself. It'll highlight examples for yourself if you don't have that privilege, but it also gives you insights into the people. Maybe I have white privilege, so by reading those statements, I get a sense of what the lived experience, just a little bit, might be like for those without it, those who are on the oppressed side of the coin. So I'm going to give a few minutes right now for people who have not completed the questionnaire to do that. This is what it looked like when you got it, and these are check boxes you can check off in the Word form. And it's dealing with the 7 primary types. There are other types of privilege that are not covered by this particular questionnaire, and I know that. These are the 7 primary types that get discussed a lot and that we're going to use today to talk a little bit about. So that's gender, sex, privilege. So biological sex determined at birth and gender, which of course we know, may or may not know on the phone, whether you're cisgendered or transgendered. Cisgendered means you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. But gender privilege, ability privilege, nationality privilege, race privilege, a class or socioeconomic status, and I've probably left one off. There are 7, and they are on that questionnaire. So I'm just going to be quiet for a couple of minutes and let people finish the questionnaire who didn't have a chance to do that. Some good questions in the chat, so keep working if you don't want me to interrupt your flow, but for this comes up a lot when we do this exercise, sort of how do I answer this, right? Because the prompt at the top is to say, if this generally describes your lived experience, mark yes, that describes my lived experience. If it doesn't, mark no. And yet some people, this has changed over time, right? So it could be that you didn't grow up with a certain amount of socioeconomic or class privilege, but you've become quite educated and achieved that. And so it has changed for you, potentially. And what I tell people, and what I tell you today, is to respond whatever makes the most sense for you. It doesn't have to be all one way or all another way in any given category. Could be there are different elements to which you would say, yes, I have this privilege now. Maybe you still don't. It's really up to you. It's whatever feels most comfortable to you. Somebody asked me if I could scroll down the screen because I can't access the questionnaire. I actually don't have the full questionnaire on a slide. I just have a picture, a clip of it to reference it. So you'll have to either use the link in the chat if you can't access that. Wanda, I don't know if you can resend the email you sent with the attachment for people to access it.
I will make sure that Christine has that document and can send it to everyone, but probably not until after the meeting today. But you'll have
okay.
Use it afterwards.
Let me see. I can maybe
because I sent it as a Dropbox link. So if you
could be there was a problem accessing it that way. Is it coming up in the link on the chat for people? Anybody who can get it? Yep, Jennifer, I see you nodding yes. Thank you.
The link is there, and I think a lot of people are able to get to it, but yeah, apologies.
No worries. These things happen when we rely on technology. It's both great and not great. I do have it. Let's see. I can take it off my slides. I think I have it up in a Word doc. and could share the Word doc. Hold on a sec. Oop. I have to stop doing this first. Sorry. Too many applications open on my screen. Let me go back.
And are we going to be going into breakouts for each privilege?
No, no, no. We don't have time for each. You're going to do a general conversation after completing it, which is why it's helpful for people to have done it. But let me try this. Okay. Can you see my screen now? I know it's small. I'll try to zoom in. Anybody can give me a, Jennifer, can you see my screen now? I can see your video. Yes. Okay. Oops. Getting this technology in the moment. So here's the gender. For those of you who didn't get it, I'll try to scroll down a little bit here. Start with this. If you can just look through this and answer yes if this describes your lived experience, and maybe just write a tick mark for every time you said yes. You'll have a total for each category. We're only tallying the yes responses. Just scroll down a little bit so we can start seeing the ability privilege section for those of you doing it on the screen. I'm going to scroll down a little further, but if I'm moving too fast on the screen, somebody let me know. So that we can see the race privilege section. All right, I'm going to move down, but tell me if I'm going too fast. It's hard to, I'm reading through them myself, but I know them, so I might be reading them faster. Somebody speak up or chat if I'm moving them too quickly. I'm going to move down to pick up some of the class privilege section. We've got religious privilege up now on the screen as well, so you're doing it via the screen. I'll keep this up for another minute before we move to the next section. All right, I'm going to move further down, but you need to tell me if I'm going too fast. Nobody's saying anything, so I'm assuming we're all tracking. We've got now race and religious and sexuality privilege on the screen. Keep moving, and I think we're picking up the last one, which is nationality privilege. So the last two sections are on the screen. Thanks to those of you who are chatting me that you finished the document. If you have already completed it, you have it on the screen in front of you, the full document, I would encourage you just to reflect for a few moments while our colleagues are completing it on what it was like to read some of these statements and to see the totals that you have in each section. Privilege on some, Maybe not privilege on others. Question came in, is there a category on ageism? That's certainly an element we could have discussed. That is not on this particular questionnaire. It's not one of the 7 primary types that we're talking about today. But we could have added ageism. There's others. Christine has emailed the link, so hopefully everybody will get that. Even if you don't have time right now to open it and complete it and you're doing it on the screen, you'll have it for later. Thank you, Christine. You have completed it either on the screen or a document that you were able to pull up. If you'll just give me the thumbs up on your screen, if you know how to do that, that would help me know sort of how many people are finished. For those who've raised their hand, is that your way of telling me you're finished? Or do you have a question?
The thumbs up doesn't stay up there for you to see more than a few seconds.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So is that why people are raising their hand, just to let me know they're finished?
Yeah, so if occasionally you just ask us to give the thumbs up again, then you'll get a better view.
Okay. Not enough people put it up the first time, so I'm assuming people are still working. You can sort of see by the video the people who are still intently reading.
If you need more time, just send a chat to everyone so we'll know. But I think we might be good to go.
Okay. All right. And if not, you can certainly discuss in the breakout groups as we go there the parts you were able to finish. I'm sorry if you didn't get time to complete all of it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now and move back to my slides. I have to share again. Give me a sec. Do that. Okay. So thanks for bearing with us and taking the time to do this in the moment. I'm sorry if you didn't receive the link ahead of time. I like this particular approach. We do it if you've seen this exercise, if you've been in classrooms with me, with participants, you've seen me do this exercise with posters around the room and paper clips, and people walk around, and it's much more tactile than we can do via Zoom. And they build a colored paperclip chain based on the amount of paper clips for each type of privilege. It's quite interactive, and it can be difficult for people, because by reading the statements, as I mentioned, you not only get a sense of, wow, what you have as privilege, but you start to get insights into when people don't have that privilege, what that looks like for them. So for a man reading the gender statements, who likely could say yes to every one of those statements in terms of their privilege, may not have thought about what women deal with who don't have privilege. The same is true for people in the race privilege category. If you're white and you have that privilege, because you have the luxury of not thinking about it, by reading those statements, which are each section, the statements are geared toward people who have privilege in that category, even if written kind of in the reverse, in the negative way of what they don't have to deal with. You start to get insights into what those lived experiences look like that are different than yours. So you get insight either way. And we take this approach in part, if you've been part of privilege walks before, those can be very powerful, but often have people then physically sort of in different spaces from each other can also be quite painful and may get at sort of all these different categories of privilege. So I like this one in particular as a way to look at some of the nuances and as a way for people to see their privilege. Even people who are oppressed in many categories or many identities have privilege in others, right? So they may be able-bodied and of a certain socioeconomic class, but be homosexual or bisexual or on the LGBTQ spectrum, and also be a person of color. So they may have privilege in ways they haven't thought about it. I have had people in classrooms tell me, gosh, I spend so much time combating the places where I don't have privilege. It never occurred to me that I have lots of identities that do give me privilege. And how can you leverage the privilege you have differently to overcome maybe areas where you don't? So we have intersectionality as individuals, right? We have different aspects to our identities that some lend themselves to us being privileged and some don't, depending on those identities. So in a moment, I'm going to have you go into breakout rooms, not quite yet, Wanda. And if you can take a picture of the screen, that would be wise to do so that you'll have these question prompts with you. But I want you to just start by sharing with the people in your small group. This time, you will be with a small group of people, around 3 or 4 people. Share the insights you gain from just completing the questionnaire about yourself, your own experience, and or the experience of others based on the statements you could say yes to. You can share, if it's helpful to you, the totals you got in certain categories. Like, wow, I was surprised I have this much privilege here, but 0 here. It's really up to you what you choose to divulge and share with those in your group. That you have that power for yourselves to decide what you want to share with in terms of the privilege of your different identities with people in your group. But I would encourage you just to share the insights at a high level, if nothing else, what you gain from completing that questionnaire about yourself and or about others. And then if you have time to move on to the other 2, I think it will be helpful to you, as I mentioned, to discuss the intersectionality involved in your own responses. So what does it mean for you to have multiple intersecting identities, privilege around some and not around others? And how does that play out in your life? We will learn from each other's lived experiences as much as we're comfortable sharing those. And then finally, what insights can you gain for your work as coaches, right? What does this mean? Knowing this about yourselves, and thus knowing that this is also what everyone you coach is dealing with, is the different levels of privilege they have. What does it mean for you to know this about yourselves and or think about it for others as you coach people? Welcome back. People are starting to come back from the breakouts. I know you probably could have used more time in those conversations. That's always the way. That's the only upside to virtual delivery is now before you had to physically nudge people to get them back into the classroom and they could linger and not come back with Zoom. You don't have a choice. You just get brought back mid-sentence, in fact. So I want to just take a few minutes to hear a little bit about those conversations. Share, without necessarily divulging or sharing too much personal information you're not comfortable with. Just tell me what value you gained from that conversation, any insight or value that came from having that discussion. Unmute or chat. I'd love to hear some voices besides my own. So if you would unmute and comfortable sharing high-level insight from the session.
Well, I became aware of things that I had not been aware of. Not from the questionnaire, but from the discussion. Questionnaire was pretty much what I thought it would be. And in the discussion, though, realizing that there's other things that I had no idea was going on. Like, for example, that if you live in a certain zip code, you can't get food delivered to you.
Right. Right. Thank you, Trudy.
So here we are in a pandemic. You can't get to if you don't have transportation to get there, but you could pay for it and they won't deliver. I was like, absolutely. Oh my God, that's just so sad all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And these are things, again, if we don't have to deal with it, we don't even have to know that that is a problem for others. And therefore do anything about it necessarily, because it's just not our lived reality. So thank you, Trudy, for sharing that.
Lynn, one thing that came out in our conversation was how our childhood and adolescence and our early parts of our life, or decisions that were made early in our life, still show up in our late adulthood or early late adulthood. And so, you know, we are multiple peoples. And it made me think about, you know, as I interact with other people, there's the person that presents themselves that I see.
That's
and
right.
There's the person, and this is not about, you know, sexual orientation or gender identity or any of that stuff, but there's a whole realm of other stuff that intersects, that goes back decades, from your home of origin, from your early life experience, from your experience in school. And it's quite a complicated, we're all quite complicated.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely right. We are all very complex human beings, which we know and at some intellectual level, and even have experienced with the people we interact with. But when you start to look at these aspects of people's identity, in addition to things like personality type or other things that we pay attention to a lot in leadership coaching, it adds a whole new context, right, to the human that you're dealing with and the environment in which they interact and how. And so, any insights? Did you get to this last question in the time you had? Any insights for how looking at this for yourself and thinking about it for people you coach, what implications it has for your coaching practice?
I hadn't we didn't discuss this, but I have thought about it because I do have clients who are African American, and we had to spend, not had to, like it was a hardship, but we did spend time talking about what was going on in the world rather than the goals of why I was working with her, you know. Yeah, that happened with a couple of different clients that I have. Yeah.
Other folks, thank you, Trudy. Any other insights other folks having about their own experience with this or coaching, how it relates to your coaching practice?
One of the things that came up in our discussion around that question was how important it is when you're working with folks who are different than you to truly listen to their stories.
Yeah.
Because when you listen to someone's story, there's usually some level of connection, though they may be different from you in gender or race or sexuality. And to have an even more heightened level of curiosity, if you will, as you listen to those stories, and to stay away from making assumptions. So yeah, that's what came out in our discussion group.
Thank you, Linda, so much. I think that's so important, right? Especially the more experienced perhaps we are at doing this, and the more we can quickly ourselves, right, create a story about, oh, I've seen this before, I know what this behavior looks like in the workplace when somebody's challenged with this. And yet, depending on the multiple nuance, to Tom's point, complexities of someone's identity and what they're dealing with in their particular context could be very different. And so the need to deeply listen to each person's individual story and situational factors and context that they're swimming in, because that affects all of it. So appreciate you raising that. Anybody else? Any last word on that last breakout discussion before we move on?
I'd like to to jump on what Linda was saying in terms of to listen to their story, but not to ignore the differences, to put the uniqueness of them on the table. Like when I'm working with somebody that's very different from me, or that has puts things in their bio, I bring it up just to see if they want to explore it more. Specifically, the question about have you ever been in a dangerous situation, a war or something like that? And if the person is a person of color, I always say, really? Can you talk more about that? Life has really been not brutal for you. And I think that or anything like that. I think those questions that are on our bio are worth exploring, even though that goes back to the white fragility thing, but it's not just about African Americans. It's just our ability to walk in places that are uncomfortable for us.
Yeah, Zippy, I appreciate that. I also, I think something you're raising for me as you say that, I don't know if this is what you also had in mind, so I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but what it raises for me is, when you're so many people have to hide their identities as they come to work. They can't bring all of their identities to their roles or to the workplace. And so what I also heard in what you said is it gives people permission in a way, if you explore that, if they want to talk about how the different aspects of their identity or their story or their experiences informs how they come at the world, how they come at problems, how they deal with other people, which that kind of permission is pretty, I think, remarkable, in and of itself, to have a safe space to talk about it. And they may not know they can even do that with their coach, right? If they're used to keeping that hidden. So thank you. I'm going to move forward. In the time we have left, we won't get to cover everything that I wanted, but I want to share this video. It's going to take about 5 minutes. And hopefully it may help if you turn off your cameras from a bandwidth perspective to ensure your internet can see the video, but chat me if for some reason you can't hear it. We tested it out while you were in breakouts and it worked for me and Wanda, but hopefully it'll work for you. Because this is a really helpful analogy to the 3 levels that we're going to play with, or use play with is the wrong word, but we're going to use racism as the construct to go a little deeper with the concept of privilege. So race privilege or racism as the oppressed version of that with this video. And it's an allegory called The Gardener by Dr. Kamara Jones from the CDC. And it's just a really helpful description. Then we'll talk about the 3 levels of racism or any ism, could be plugged in here, that we'll explore a little bit after this. So chat me if you can't hear it, but otherwise I'm going to let this video play. Whoops. Sorry.
This story is about a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms and some is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. And she takes the pink seed and she puts it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she comes and she's looking at her flower boxes, and what she notices is that every single one of the red seeds has sprouted. And some of the seed is tall, some of the red flowers are tall and strong and flourishing. The weak seed in the red at least has sprouted and made it to a middling height. But when she looks in the pink box, in that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And the strong pink seed is just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens, until finally, 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. Now we'll interrupt that to say that this first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works. You had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil. You had the flower boxes, the contemporary structural factors, keeping the soil separate. And then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of that difference. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in this garden? Well, that's when the gardener's looking at her flowers and she says, those pink flowers are so scraggly and scrawny, and she plucks those blossoms off before they can even go to seed. Or she might notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, and she plucks it out before it can establish itself. And then where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, you have the pink flowers in their box trying to make it, looking over at red, which is all flourishing and flaunted. And here come the bees, and the bees are minding their own business. They're just collecting nectar, but they're pollinating at the same time, so the bees are buzzing around. Here come the bees to the pink flowers, and it comes over to this one pink flower, and the pink flower says, "Get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red," because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So then the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, you could say, well, let's address the internalized racism. So we're going to go over to the pink flowers and we're going to say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, which might make the pink flowers feel better, but that in and of itself is not going to change the conditions in which they live. Or you could say, okay, well, I understand that. Let's address the personally mediated racism. So let's go talk to the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener, which is all good. But we're going to say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink blossoms? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. What you really need to do if you want to set things right in this garden is to address the institutionalized racism. So you have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's okay too, although to me it makes it easier to segregate resources. But if you want to keep separate boxes, then you have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, you know the pink flowers will flourish. They will look grand and beautiful and wonderful, maybe even better than the red, because they have, after all, been selected for survival and strength, which is a very, very interesting notion. And then once those pink flowers are flourishing, they'll no longer be looking over at red, wanting to be red. So you'll have also addressed the internalized racism. And in addressing the institutionalized racism, you may even address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children, seeing the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to adopt that attitude. So this story has very quickly been to illustrate these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. We can address the other levels at the same time, but we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. And when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. There's just one last piece to this story, which is the important question: who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I've given the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources. And who is this gardener really? Well, certainly government is part of the gardener. You know, sometimes I joke and say, well, maybe the rich people behind government are part of the gardener. Maybe we can be our own gardener in communities if we have this power to decide, power to act, and control of resources, which is what I also describe as self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, whoever's going to have this power, it's very important that the gardener be concerned with equity. If the gardener is not concerned with equity, then you'll have the scrawny looking pink flowers and the pretty red flowers, and the gardener will be thinking that the garden is beautiful when in fact it is not.
Okay. So you can bring your video back up if you like, because I like seeing your faces. Hopefully you could all hear that. I have found when I try to read chat and play the video that it wouldn't, it would stop the video, so I couldn't look at your chat. So hopefully the test with the one I did worked and everybody could hear it okay. I love Dr. Camara Jones's allegory on that, because it just very succinctly captures what are very complex elements of this ism, racism, but you could put sexism, heterosexism, any number of the isms into that same story and have a similar experience. And the three levels: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. These show up, right, for each of us in our own experiences, depending on our privilege or oppression in any given category, in terms of how people treat us, in terms of the structures, the policies, the practices that are in place, and then of course internalized messages we may have about them. I will tell you for myself, as much as I would qualify myself as a staunch feminist and have felt that way for many, many years, probably really kind of adopted that term for myself in undergraduate in the 80s. and have felt that way, I will still use statements or make references that about women in my own house, and that I wouldn't agree with if I heard them based on learned behavior, things I was taught, messages I was given. I was the only girl of a family with 3 brothers, messages I was given about being female, and my sons, who I've raised to be more woke, I guess I would say, in current vernacular than a lot of their white male peers, will call me on it. My oldest in particular is very studied in these topics. He really examines them, and he'll say, "Mom, that was a really sexist thing you just said." And I'll have to catch myself and go, "Oh my gosh, right." You know, just ingrained to think that a certain aspects of being female, for instance, for me, come with certain stereotypical responses. And so I'm surprised myself as much as what I'm saying, as much as I've looked at all these topics and I teach them to other people and work with leaders on them, how much I've internalized some of the messaging that has been given to me by either family members or society or other elements of people in my village throughout my life. And that has been obviously personally mediated by other people at times, and then there's institutional norms and practices that follow it. And so we only have about 5 or so, 7 minutes left in our time together. So I'm not going to send you back into breakout rooms to have this conversation because we don't have a lot of time. You get yanked back just as you got into the conversation. And there are definitions for these. I'm happy to share these slides that she illustrated beautifully. Institutionalized, right, is the differential access to goods and services that people have. And it happens through acts of commission. So literally policies and practices, laws that are in place that keep people down, and or omission, which means inaction in the face of it. And so that's often you may be hearing right now, right? It's not enough to be against racism. We need you to be an active anti-racist. White allyship is getting a lot more prevalence. People are stepping more into the role of being a white ally in the face of racism, which is great to see. And it's not enough just to believe that's wrong, right? You need to act against it. Do something to help change it in the spheres of influence in which you operate. Where do you have some control? And to interrupt it when you see it, or to take action in the face of it. So I wanted to call that commission or omission out in that. Personally mediated, certainly differential assumptions people make, our biases, the stereotypes and prejudices we each hold, we each have them, and how we might act on those. In the ways we hire, or in the ways we treat people, or in the ways we make assumptions and make up stories about the people that we interact with who are different from ourselves. And then the internalized, as I mentioned, acceptance of members of the stigmatized group, identity group, of believing about their worth or about who they should be, or who they are based on the messages they've received. And so each of these plays out, and they're interconnected. And I think they're playing out all the time, especially for the people that you're coaching. And so what I wanted you to get to in a breakout, and instead we'll just take some comments now in the time we have left, people's thoughts about this. How aware were you before today about your own privilege, first of all? We already heard a little bit about that from the first breakout room. How about these 3 different levels of how it plays out? Internalized, personally mediated, and institutionalized. Had you heard about that or thought about those different levels or experienced that with yourself or people that you work with in the past? Let's just hear some responses to having those 3 layers or levels of racism as the construct we're talking about specifically today pointed out to you. What does that conjure up?
Do you need me?
You can chat a response, or you can verbalize a response. Yes, Scott in the chat, thanks for calling out. We definitely, our biases are learned, and Jane Elliott's work on the blue and brown eye experiment from the 60s is excellent. There's a lot of YouTube clips out there on that you can watch if you haven't. I would recommend it. How quickly she takes in the experiment, she takes a group of, I think they're 2nd graders maybe, through a process of sort of preferring blue-eyed children one day and brown-eyed children the next day, and how quickly the students fall into the pattern of believing their own worth if they are the preferred group, or the lack of worth if they are not the preferred group. It's like a nanosecond it takes for them to, and so you can imagine, we see how it has played out in society over hundreds of years, how we see and prejudice different aspects of identity. Not seeing a lot of comment or hearing. Yep, go ahead.
This is Jennifer. In one of our earlier conversations, maybe it was the second one, and we were talking about awareness of our own privilege. It's sort of, it's like an onion, you know, it reveals itself in stages and in layers based on what's happening in your life. And so I think I'm not fully yet aware of all the levels of my own privilege.
Yeah, it does. It's a journey. It takes time. Somebody will have to watch the video again, and I'm happy to send the slides, and it's embedded in there, but you can look it up on YouTube as well, or Google search it. Dr. Camara Jones, Allegory on race, or racism. It is, it's true, Jennifer, right? There's a lot to it, and it takes a lot of sort of just thought and process time that you haven't necessarily had today to dig into it. I was in a session, and I don't know that there was a particular coach that's probably in this group that was involved in this particular class. I won't call out by name, but who did a great job. But there was a participant in a class that I was working with several years ago now. An older gentleman, prominent position, working with a lot of other, you know, leaders like him, nonprofits in the room, going through this exercise and having this conversation. And he really had such an eye-opening moment for himself, how much he had internalized the messages that being homosexual was wrong. He was a closeted gay male and had been his whole career and was still not out. And he felt like, again, this just gave him permission to recognize that he had internalized the messages there was something wrong with him and that he needed to keep this aspect of his identity hidden. Great deal of shame he had carried and was still carrying, and the permission he felt to sort of deal with it through this session was powerful. But it's surprising for those of us who have a great deal of privilege, right? If you're a white, cisgendered male that is heterosexual and Christian and able-bodied, U.S. citizen, highly degreed, then you've got all the privilege, right, for the most part. And so you don't have to tend to these things normally in your daily life. And so it can be surprising when people show up with elements of themselves that cause them great trauma or stress on an everyday basis, to even recognize it as, oh my gosh, I never would have thought about that as something you have to deal with. And so again, in your coaching practice, I would encourage you, because certainly now that this is, with the times we're living in now, COVID before even the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, add the names you want to the list, before those recent horrible incidents that happened, COVID was bringing into stark relief the differences in terms of privilege. And somebody mentioned it now, right? You can't even get to the grocery store to get food, and you can't get it delivered if you live in a certain zip code. It is bringing out the disparities that exist due to things like these multiple elements of privilege. We're being brought into stark relief with something like COVID, with the pandemic. And then you add the racism that's now prevalent, that people have hopefully reached a tipping point of trying to do something about. And this is going to keep showing up in your coaching, I feel sure, as you're working with people. This is more and more going to be part of the story and part of what's the context that needs to be dealt with. More and more corporations and other organizations that we work with at CCL are asking us for specific interventions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so the coaching practice, in your coaching practice, you will need to be able to deal with this. And I think the more you've examined it for yourself and thought about, therefore, what at the internal, if people have internalized these messages, what you can help them do, that's a great place to begin with your coaching, which you probably have already dealt with many people you coach. Personally mediated, right? How they can try to deal with that in their own context. Institutionalized, it varies their ability to affect that depending on the level they are in the organization. But I know many of you work with senior executives. So even helping them think about the platforms they have to create change in their own systems of influence around these things is important. And we are out of time. So I'm going to turn it back over to Wanda for some final announcements, and then I'll try to keep up with the chat. Hopefully that's in the recording and I can answer any questions I didn't address, and I'll send the slides so Wanda can share those afterwards. But thank you for spending the last not quite 2 hours exploring this topic with me, and for your engagement. Wanda, take it away.
Thank you, Lynn.
So much. Lynn, if I can have you unshare your screen. Excellent. And thank you so much for this powerful program. We're going to continue the conversation. So 2 weeks from today, we have scheduled the Diversity Committee, and thank you to the Diversity Committee for the hard work that has gone into this, this program. And I have a treat for you. So I'm going to share my screen and play you a trailer for our upcoming for our August 24th. So here we go.
Hello, I'm Linda Reese, a partner on the Diversity Committee at Triad Coaching Connection. First, I'd like to thank Lynn Fick Cooper and the Dr. Harrell Roberts for this thought-provoking message on privilege, white or otherwise. Lynn has pulled back the curtain and allowed us to examine the impacts of privilege on our society. It's a great starting point, but the Diversity Committee has more. We invite you to tune in and continue the conversation with us at an upcoming event on Monday, August 24th at 5:30 p.m. At that time, we will explore the subject of bias and how to overcome it. So if you haven't already, please view Verna Meyer's TED Talk on how to overcome biases. A link has been forwarded to the membership. As coaches in this moral moment, it is critical that we move forward with deliberate, conscious efforts to effect positive change. The Diversity Committee at TCC is proud to offer yet another opportunity for enlightenment. Please join us on August 24th. And remember, stay woke. Hello, I'm Linda Reese, a partner on the Diversity Committee at Triad Coaching Connection.
There we go. Excellent. Wasn't she fantastic? So did you notice the time? August 24th, 5:30 p.m. You will be receiving more information about this, but I would like for you to be sure that you take a look at the video, the Verna Myers video. I have put that link in the chat several times today, having learned that if you drop off and rejoin, the chat changes. So in order to save the chat for yourself, down, if you have chat box open, there's 3 little dots down there where you would write a message. There's 3 little dots. When you click on those dots, you get a command to save chat, and you can save the chat. So I am going to do that right this moment, and it is saved. If you didn't get a chance to save that chat and you would like a copy of the chat for today, just let me know and I will get that information to you. Are there any other announcements for today? Anybody have anything that they want to share with the group before we close? All right. Thank you so much for attending. I see folks waving goodbye. Yes, very good presentation. Thank you, Lynn, and everybody. Have a wonderful week. Let's see. We had hurricane, earthquake. Good Lord. Let's have a good week. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Welcome. Linda, I think it was well received. You're on mute.
Are you talking to me? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Linda, I was telling Linda Reese. I think her video was well received. And Lynn, I think you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a good video.
Good.
So much information, and I'm thankful that you're willing to share your presentation so we can process the information a little deeper, especially those of us on the committee who are going to continue the conversation on the 24th to pull your, to build on what you've just said and to reinforce those concepts. I think that'll be tremendous.
I will happily send you
So those of you
The
who have stayed
slides.
behind, is there any questions or comments or all right. Thank you.
I just want to say again to Lynn, thank you, Lynn, for doing this today. It's a wonderful job. You, yourself, what you bring to the table, it helps us to move forward as a group and to be more, if you will, woke to what's going on in the world. And you're helping us do that. So well done. Thank you, Madam Navigator.
Oh,
Yes, Wanda, thank you so much for all your support. I'm sorry I stressed you out with not being on the prep half hour.
You know, it's team. We would have had it anyway.
We made it work.
Somehow.
We made it work.
Yes.
Yep. Well, thank you.
And I owe you one, so if I can never do anything for you.
Yeah, you were great. I appreciate the support. Having you produce this session was helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye. Take care now.